Hello, this is Transparency. We are a group of trans adults who speak openly and honestly about our experiences with gender dysphoria and transition, and how these experiences are shaped by, but also at odds with, the currently popular narrative of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. All right, thank you for tuning in to Transparency, everybody. We have a very exciting episode today. We've got the world famous, literally world famous, Lisa Shupe on with us. Previously, or probably more newsworthy, notably as Jamie Shupe, Lisa now. So she is joining us today to talk about her experience with autogynephilia, detransition, retransition, and everything all in between. So thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. Well, I think I would rather preface that with infamous rather than famous.
Okay.
I don't look back fondly on the whole thing. I mean, if I could turn back the clock and make it disappear, I would.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of where I'm at on the non-binary thing.
Okay.
I don't think it's real. I don't think it's healthy.
You have a fascinating story in terms of how you became that. Is it North America or the first American legally non-binary person? Can you maybe tell a bit about that story and how that came to be?
Yeah, it's well, I'm the first legally non-binary person in the United States. I'm not sure about Canada, I don't think they had any legal recognition at the time. And
this was 2016, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I just had the anniversary not long ago, the 5-year anniversary on June 10th, 2016, and that was kind of traumatic too. So are you wanting to hear how it kind of came about?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just telling that story of how that came about and why you decided to become legally non-binary.
Yeah. It's lengthy. I'll try to shorten it up for as much as possible. But so I did a gender transition to female in 2013. And it was literally, it kind of mirrored the rapid onset gender dysphoria situation, because let's go back a little bit to my childhood. Okay, my childhood was kind of like the desert island thing. I wasn't exposed to any gay people. I knew absolutely nothing about transgenderism, transsexuality. I then went into the military and, of course I was aware of gay people, but the transgenderism thing was still, not on my radar whatsoever. And I also didn't research it because once I started cross-dressing, I was literally like scared that if I ever got investigated for, having sex with men, that might come up too. They would, for instance, like CID might go in and check my web history. So I never, it was kind of like Pandora's box that I never opened. And, my start down the gender path was actually pornography. There's a really interesting article from Dr. Ken the Sucker, and he actually mentions that in it that pornography is one of the triggers for transvestic fetishism. So I started becoming heavily involved in pornography as a means of, it was a stress relief, because drugs are a career ender and alcohol was a career ender, and I was seeing large numbers of people flame out, especially from alcohol. So pornography seemed relatively harmless. Okay, so I started viewing a lot of pornography, and the way it affected me was I started seeing myself as in the role of the female. When it was straight porn. I looked at a male and a female having sex, and I was identifying more and more with the female, and that eventually led to cross-dressing, and that eventually led to having sex with men, dressed as a female and imagining myself as a female.
Can I stop you real quick?
Sure.
So I know you weren't aware of any of transgenderism as a young person before, probably in the military. You're saying probably in your 20s that you got got like basically developed a porn addiction, correct?
Mhm.
So you didn't have any kind of, I know Blanchard talks about, there's usually like or like prepubescent interest in cross dressing or some sort of female role playing that usually early in life. That you're saying that didn't happen for you?
Nope.
Okay.
And back to the desert island thing. Okay, so I was in a family of all boys. My sister wasn't born till literally like when I was going into the military. There was 8 of us kids, 7 boys and 1 girl. And my mother was constantly pregnant, having babies. I would not describe her as feminine whatsoever. There were none of those influences. I wasn't sneaking around in anybody's underwear drawer or nothing. I with no exposure to it whatsoever. It wasn't in my life. It never even occurred to me. It all manifested after the pornography thing. And I went through the military like that. Cross-dressing, occasionally having sex with men, as cautiously as possible. And I popped out of the military like that. And by then I was the father of a daughter. And I retired in 2000 because of an injury. And then I spent for literally from 2000 to 2012, just being involved in being her father, making sure she had a place to live and all that good stuff, taking care of her needs, and didn't act on it whatsoever. And then I had like a super major mental health crisis between 2011 and 2012. And I mean, it was really bad. I destroyed like a $365,000 house. My PTSD was out of control. Paranoid ideation. I literally thought like the FBI was after me. I mean, it was crazy stuff. And after the house ordeal, I lived in hotels for 6 months. I'm still thinking that like the FBI was after me, that they were going to arrest me because I had gotten into it with the neighbors with Glocks and assault rifles and all that sort of crazy military crap. And eventually I ended up in a cabin in Western Maryland, and I'm way off deep in the woods. And I was like, okay, what's wrong with me? I've got to do something about this before I end up getting arrested. And I got on the internet and started, researching mental health. And it started linking to gender identity disorder and transsexualism and all that. And back to literally like the ROGD thing is literally, as soon as I discovered that stuff, it was like, bam, this is what's wrong with me. And if I do a gender transition, I'll be fixed if it's going to help my mental health issues. And there was lots of bad enablers that made the whole thing worse. I don't know if you've ever seen my interview with Benjamin Boyce, but there's a screenshot on there. All right, I'm sure y'all are familiar with Dr. Norman Spack, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, SPAC is basically like the grandfather of puberty blockers. He's the one credited with pioneering their use in the United States. So around the time I'm going through this meltdown, SPAC does an interview and it claims that puberty blockers and gender transitions can cure bipolar disorder, which is one of my diagnoses. And then one of the WPATH gurus, which is Ann Vitale, had another article, and she was framing it as Vitale is a trans woman. I didn't know that at the time, but Vitale was claiming that this was like an anxiety-based disorder, and that again, hormones and a gender transition can fix this stuff. So, I jumped in feet first into the gender transition, and that was in early 2013. Literally, like hormones on the first day. First time I had an appointment, I got hormones. And so I really didn't know much about what was the motivations behind what I was doing. And I moved along. That went up till 2015, me living as a trans woman. And in late 2015, it all started falling apart. I was looking inward at my behavior, and I'm going like, look, I'm really not a woman. I'm not a female. And that was kind of the birth of the non-binary thing. It became an escape hatch to get me out of the female identity I'd become trapped in.
And then you ended up reclaiming male identity on your ID legally after that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's another really tough journey because, I just got, you might as well say I jumped from one frying pan to another. The court case happened in June of 2016. And by November of 2016, it was already kind of falling apart for me. But yet, I had the problem now compounded because I was literally internationally famous for becoming the first non-binary person, legally non-binary person. And once again, it was like, how do I get myself out of this mess? And that was an epic struggle to unwind. Basically, 3 psychiatric hospitalizations it took to unwind it. A lot of thoughts about suicide along the way, which almost seemed like an easier solution than unwinding the mess and telling the truth about the whole thing and coming clean. Yeah. So late 2019, with help, I formally reversed the court case and changed my name back to James Shupe.
People seem to be under the impression that that detransition is an easy process. I mean, even we get asked, because we question the ideology, people ask, well, why don't you just stop taking testosterone? And people don't tend to realize that it is a complicated process to reverse our decision to transition.
One of the things I take issue with is the language. And I hope this isn't offensive to anybody, but okay, so we've been given this set of language to how we frame our experiences. This that we transition, we detransition, we retransition. But my question on that, is it really true? I don't think it is. Again, it makes it sound good selling it to the public, but did I really go from being a natal male to being a female to being non-binary to back to male and now back under the female umbrella? Was all of that real? Sure, I took hormones and I cosmetically changed my body, but other than that, it's again not real.
What did I agree with you entirely on all of that. My question is, so the non-binary designation, did that really have that much of an obviously it had a huge impact on your mental health and whatnot, but was that more to do with the media fiasco around it and how much attention was put on you? Because I can't imagine just having non-binary on your birth certificate, it's not really going to have much of an impact on your life outside of the media attention and how much that fallout from it. Could you talk, like, what was that that caused such a so much turmoil for you?
Again, because it wasn't true. So we should clarify about the X marker, which is what you get for, like, say for example, on a driver's license. Okay, in reality, the X marker is supposed to mean sex not specified. So it's not really that you don't have a sex, but what happens in the gendered mind, we don't think that. For me, it meant that I was like some hybrid intersex species where, I had male biology and a female gender identity, and those two formed this non-binary being. Well, none of that's true. So now, used properly, I won't totally denounce the non-binary thing, but if you're twisting it around in your head and you're not viewing reality, then I think it's harmful.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that was the case with me. It was harmful. And I became this vehicle for the LGBT organizations to latch onto me and run with it. So even though, I had correctly been, not assigned male at birth, I was observed male at birth.
Mhm.
I am biologically male. I have no known disorders of sexual development. An endocrinologist has checked me out. So, but yet here, LGBT organizations helped me to change my birth certificate to read as unknown instead of male. Again, that's very problematic when it's not true. And the proper wording for that is it's called a legal fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And to my understanding, legal fictions aren't supposed to hurt anybody. Well, it was hurting me. Yes, it was hurting me, and my actions were also hurting other people. Even more so when I'm under the female umbrella. I mean, at one point, I had a female birth certificate as well.
Hmm.
Before, my birth certificate was originally changed from male to female, and then it was changed to the unknown, aka the non-binary thing. Again, that was a first in history in Washington, D.C. Nobody, according to the documents, nobody in Washington, D.C. had ever had a birth certificate with anything other than male or female. And here, I was used to break that barrier in a fraudulent.
And that was meant to be a solution to the fraudulent F on your birth certificate, but it didn't relieve that disconnect with reality. It just created a whole new one. Right.
Yes. I guess you can frame me in some twisted ways like the Reimer boy. Are y'all familiar with David Reimer
Yeah.
and John Money and all that? Well, it's like, even if I want to believe because of the autogynephilia, no matter what you do to me in my alone in the dark moments, I still know that I'm a male. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that we've all talked about. Obviously, we're all female to male. Obviously, male is the fictional part, but we present as men. All of us, like, there's a big difference we find between the autogynephilic experience of transgenderism, and for us, like, I know personally, I mean, I definitely have dysphoria about the fact that I'm female, but it's more like I never found any relief in it. It's hard to explain. The fact that I'm female has always remained consistent. I've never tried to challenge that. I mean, there's an M on my driver's license, but my birth certificate has always and will always be an F. The way that I look at it is like I can change my current legal designation as male because that's how I present in the world. But I can never change the fact that I was born female, and I can't change the fact that I am female. But I certainly can't change the fact that I was, obviously observed female at the time of my birth. That is correct in my birth certificate. So I'm not sure how you guys feel about the whole birth certificate designation change. That always felt to me like just going too far. I know I was kind of pushed along that path, a decade ago when I transitioned, but it always seemed like this doesn't seem right. I don't know what you guys' take on that.
At the time, I thought it was awesome, because at the time I had been ideologically captured, and I think I really believed that in that some part of me, or that in some way that I was
But
male.
you also had an intersex condition as well.
Yeah, that complicates it for me, for sure. And I still find that confusing to kind of, to sort of navigate that part of it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that there is something for me, it was like a complete erasure. By putting it on your birth certificate, it almost felt like, okay, this is correcting the mistake that had been made at my birth, right? Is how it felt at the time. But yeah, I've mixed feelings about it now.
Kenneth, you joined us just after we started recording. Welcome.
Yeah.
Hey. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it creates the compassion that led the doctors to have this legal fiction created has resulted in a very toxic environment, where now you have people arguing that they're literally gone from being female to being male, or male to being female. So yeah, I mean, I had all of my documentation switched over, but I think in Canada there's actually an onus to have all your documentation say the same thing. Like I know that once you begin a legal name change, you have a certain amount of time to complete it on all of your provincial and federal documentation, and then I think you have a year to complete it on any, like, notify your bank, notify your school, your employer, whatever, right?
It's a very streamlined process there.
Yes, there's a, I forget what it's called, but there's the requirement that all of it say the same thing. So I don't know that a person could actually, well, who knows what it's like now, but at one time, I'm not sure a person could have legally left their birth certificate and changed their other documentation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if people realize that or not, but yeah.
And Lisa, no, you are going back to not identifying as, but presenting as. What is? I know you think obviously retransition isn't exactly a real thing, but what is it that you are kind of? Where are you now in this?
I'm kind of screwed up in the medical system right now because, again, I'm not actually retransitioning to anything. Nothing has actually changed. But what's happened to me is, okay, so when I quote detransitioned back in 2019, what I didn't really expect to happen was, it sounds good that I'm just going to detransition and go back to, quote, living as a male, get off of hormones, just knock the crap off and end it all. But okay, so that worked until the testosterone started coming back in my system. And once it did, the paraphilia returned with it, the desire to cross-dress, to act out sexually. Okay, but when I said that I had told my care team at the VA, which was a real fiasco, that I was reclaiming my male identity, their first knee-jerk reaction was to cut off my hormones. They just killed my hormone prescriptions, which was not my intent. I wanted to stay on hormones, keep my testosterone blocked. And because I was so high profile, it was almost kind of comical. They had to reach out to what they call the national LGBT coordinator at the VA and say, what are we going to do with Shupe? Shupe wants to detransition. This isn't supposed to happen. So, they told him what to do with me. It was comical. I went to Social Security and I had a letter from the doctor, endocrinologist, stating that I was biologically male and that I was reclaiming my male identity. Well, Social Security kicked me out. And they were like, you have to go through a gender transition to male in order to get your identity back to male. I mean, how much of a lie was that? I don't think people even think about that. It sounds good on the way in, but what happens on the way out? Did I really transition back to male? That was totally untrue. I didn't do anything to transition back to male. So okay, so we will.
What were they requiring?
Huh?
What were they requiring? What do you mean that you had to transition back to male? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
It means I had to go back to the endocrinologist and get like one of those State Department letters stating that I had appropriate therapy, hormone therapy or surgeries,
Okay.
blah, 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 and that I had transitioned back to male.
Okay.
So the endocrinologist had to perjure himself writing that letter because it wasn't true. I mean, how nutty is that? Okay, so we got all that done and I was officially changed back to male. And here I am sitting there, my gender dysphoria is back because I'm not on hormones. The autogynephilia is back. The bad sexual behavior is back. So I'm sitting around with literally like a shopping bag full of supplements trying to knock down my testosterone because they've cut my hormones off. I didn't want to go back to the hospital. At one point, they actually put me in the psych ward because they thought I was going to kill myself. The VA committed me using Florida's Baker Act. And by, New Year's Day of 2020, I had a blood clot in my leg from eating the supplements. So that was kind of the wake up call for everybody that they were going to have to put me back on hormones. But we had another fight over that with my care team at the VA, because the only way they would agree to put me back on hormones and block my testosterone was I had to claim that I was undergoing a gender transition. Again, that I was being treated with transgender woman protocols. So, after everything I had just went through, I was like, fine, it's semantics. You can call it whatever you want. Just block my testosterone. And, we did that. So, all right. So that got me through 2020, most of 2020. But then I moved in October. And when I moved and I showed up at a new VA facility, for whatever reason, blame it on COVID or normal backlogs at the VA, I couldn't get my testosterone blocked again until March. Well, actually, that didn't even happen in March. So I went from November to March without an appointment. And in the interim, it got into some really crazy behavior. Are y'all familiar with estrogel? It's probably like testosterone gels, except it's estrogen. I was literally smearing estrogel on my testicles and also on my nipples because the gender dysphoria was so bad. And I finally got into seeing an endocrinologist in March, and we had a really nasty discussion. It went like back and forth, like, are you transitioning to female? And I'm like, no, that's not possible. I'm a male. I just want to be, treated under the transgender woman protocols, and I'm not making any other changes. And back and forth we went like that. And afterwards, she kicked me out of the office and said, "I'll see you in 4 months." And once again, I ended up in the psych ward, ready to kill myself over the whole mess, because I was literally like ready to cut my testicles off. And when I got out of the psych ward, it kind of dawned on me that, if I don't just go along with the program and claim that I'm transitioning and stay under the female umbrella, this is how my life is going to be. So that is how I've been reverted back to Lisa again.
Because at any time, was there any other option for managing your dysphoria presented to you other than just, medicalizing and transitioning to female? Was that ever part of the conversation?
It was literally medical malpractice in the psych ward, because here I am locked in there from April 16th to April 29th. And I had this little team of psychiatrists that would visit me once a day and torture me. And they would ask me what is your identity? And I was saying, well, I'm male. And I was telling them that I was suffering from the paraphilia, autogynephilia, and I was also suffering from gender dysphoria. And they equated that as long as I was telling them that I was a male, that it was impossible for me to have gender dysphoria and that I wasn't entitled to any care. They literally wrote in my medical records that, it's like I said, it's medical malpractice. One of them wrote in there that notably autogynephilia is not in the DSM, but patient keeps claiming that they have this disorder. Autogynephilia, to my knowledge, is listed in the DSM 7 times. And then 2 supervising psychiatrists signed off on that note. And that was how the whole psych ward experience went, day after day. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing too, and I don't think many people were even aware of this. So autogynephilia is a paraphilia, sexual paraphilia. And to my understanding, there's literally US government laws that prevent the treatment of paraphilias. You can't, in other words, you can't have insurance coverage to treat a paraphilia. But on the other hand, you can get all the treatments you want for gender dysphoria with insurance coverage. And I think the roots of that is basically, why the whole thing was changed from gender identity disorder to the gender dysphoria thing.
Okay. So in that sense, there is a purpose to the fiction that that this is just that autogynephilia doesn't exist. It's only gender identity. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I was saying is gender identity disorder got morphed into, rebranded as gender dysphoria in order to evade the insurance exclusion about treating paraphilias. As Dr. Ann Lawrence says, autogynephilia is the paraphilia that underlies transvestism.
Right.
Right. So technically, that's an important part of this discussion. It's this chicken and the egg thing. What comes first? Okay, so in my case, we know that pornography came first, and then that resulted in transvestism and the autogynephilia, the desire to see myself in the image of a woman and have sex as a woman. So that's paraphilic. Okay,
Mhm.
and then the end result of that was gender dysphoria.
Right.
The frustration that I had to turn myself into a woman to match that whole thing.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Right. So if it had stayed if no changes had ever been made, there wouldn't be any insurance coverage for me to do anything about it. So the thing was rebranded into gender dysphoria. It's no longer a paraphilia. We don't talk about that anymore. And they just treat me for gender dysphoria. That's the trans narrative these days.
Yeah.
And it's different for
Mhm.
males. The whole experience is different for males, of course, than it is for females.
Yeah, it's a completely different thing. I was saying, like I started talking about it recently. My experience with what we'd call autoandrophilia, which I think I think that only exists as a is a solution to dysphoria. It doesn't cause dysphoria. The initial cause was gender. Well, I don't know what caused the gender dysphoria per se, but I had gender dysphoria all my life, and then once I got to an age of being sexually interested, that was funneled into gay male sex because that didn't involve female anatomy, which I was repulsed by. Right. So it was the gender dysphoria led to it having to express my sexuality or to access sexuality, I guess, in a way that excluded my female body, right? So with autogynephilia, it seems that the gender dysphoria follows the paraphilic attraction to the self as a woman,
Exactly.
and so when that paraphilia is confronted with a physical body that contradicts it, that causes gender dysphoria. So yeah, definitely chicken versus egg.
Yeah, I mean, the thing we have to realize, it wasn't on my radar a couple of years ago, but again, the thing we have to realize in this discussion about detransition, okay, say that I was a female who had been raped, or say that I was a female who couldn't fit myself into society's version of what I was supposed to be as a female, and as a result, I did a quote gender transition to male, for all the wrong reasons. And along the way somehow develop gender dysphoria as well, or maybe not. I mean, I can't speak for females. Okay, so but on the subject of detransition, you could take a person like that and you could walk them back through their life and start peeling back the layers of that onion and get them to understand what happened to them. Okay, my situation as a male is totally different because we're dealing with a sexual paraphilia. The paraphilia is like the four most common ones, I think, are pedophilia, transvestism, exhibitionism, things of that nature. Okay. And I mean, according to the experts in the literature, you can't get rid of a paraphilia. So how can a person like me technically detransition if the motivation for my transition in the first place is a sexual paraphilia? I mean, that's like telling a pedophile that they can't be a pedophile anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can technically do it. I take Lupron once again, and it's again, the dynamics of how these two tie together is priceless because you give a pedophile Lupron, which is leuprolide acetate, and they lose their sexual desire, and they can make rational decisions about their behavior and not offend anymore. It's the exact same thing for me. You give me Lupron, which I'm 3 months back into it. I'm already, losing the sexual component of the female clothing. I could care less about screwing around with men and having them validate me with a female. I'm essentially the same as the pedophile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Some people, just picking up on the point you made, that when you were on the estrogen, that the paraphilic feelings started to dissipate, and when you went back on and when you went off of the estrogen, those feelings started to come up again. So some people might interpret that as, well, the treatment was successful if it alleviated your gender dysphoria by transitioning to female, to use that language. So but in your mind, it doesn't sound like you felt that was a successful treatment, because it caused. Can you just unpack that a little bit? Like, why wasn't for you that successful treatment if it did help your dysphoria?
Well, first off, I should say that at high doses, you can do the same thing with estrogen that you can do with anti-androgen drugs to a male. You can totally kill off my sex drive if you give me enough anti-estrogen or anti-androgens or both.
Like how they treat homosexual males, historically.
Yeah.
Like Alan Turing and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. Right. The drugs have changed, and well, of course, but historically, you're correct. I don't know what they were giving Alan Turing back then. But to speak to the other Aaron's point, okay, so it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, when we were talking about how no matter what they did to me, I knew that I was a male, even though I wanted the female thing because of autogynephilia. Well, we're kind of back to the same problem again. Okay, if we frame this as gender dysphoria, we're lying about my underlying problem. My underlying problem is the paraphilia. So I want to be honest about that instead of, falling under this gender, even though I have gender dysphoria, and even though I'm entitled to treatment for it, the underlying cause of my gender dysphoria is the paraphilia. So we need to be honest about that and be treating me for, in my opinion, for the paraphilia.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. I just wanted to make sure that we were kind of closing that gap, because some people might sort of hear what you're saying and interpret that as, when you started the estrogen and claimed a female identity, that it did seem to resolve your gender dysphorias from. Do you know what I mean? So if we don't go deeper into that, some people might interpret that as, well, that's because the treatment was successful if it relieved your dysphoria. But I think what I hear you saying is that it was an indirect resolution of your dysphoria, because it wasn't really targeting the root cause. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, to say it bluntly, it's putting lipstick on the pig. Yeah.
So now you're finding other ways of targeting the paraphilia specifically without interfering with your gender identity.
Yeah, I'm paraphilia, being I'm back on Lupron, is totally back under control. Now, as far as gender expression, I would rather run around and, of course, not mini skirts and things of that nature, but I would rather, appearance-wise, dress as a, somewhat of a casual female clothing. So that presentation is just a good fit for my personality and who I am. But there's no disillusion anymore about me being a male, what my problems are, what needs to be done to treat those problems and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've talked about that theme quite a bit amongst us, and I'm in agreement with you. I think the material reality for me is that I am female, or with an intersex condition. I still feel more comfortable presenting as I do. I've always had other than the beard, I've presented this way forever. Like, even as a kid, I preferred to have short hair, and so for me, it wasn't like the invention of a new persona, the way some people describe it, because I don't behave or act or look much different other than the facial hair growth. So I do feel more comfortable in my own body presenting this way, but you're right that there's layers to be peeled back, right? And my concern with this narrative, the transgender narrative that's going around, I think it prevents people from peeling back those layers, because that narrative is external to us, right? It's queer theory based, it's cultural based, it's politically motivated, it's not internal. And I think when we identify with that external narrative, it prevents us from going inward and actually doing some of that work and finding some of the root causes for our dysphoria. And I think that root cause is probably different from person to person, potentially. There's probably themes and trends amongst people, but I think that's the work that I've done. And it's sad that it gets interpreted as transphobic, because just because I've gone in and done my internal work and resolved some things emotionally and recovered my mental health, that somehow is seen as transphobic. It's like, well, wasn't wellness and mental health the whole point? Like, when did we lose that plot?
There's a distinct confliction between what normally or what often underlies female gender dysphoria and what underlies male gender dysphoria, which is more often than not autogynephilia, is causing that. So it's distinctly different in that we could do work, we could dig up our early childhood experiences or our lives and kind of unpack how the dysphoria was caused, where it got us, but with like what Lisa was saying with autogynephilia, it's like you can only unpack it to the point that this is a paraphilia, and you can't unlearn or undo the paraphilia. You have to manage it, and that's why when all these conversations we have, it seems like as contradictory as this is to the gender critical narrative or the true trans or whatever narrative is, to me it seems like autogynephilia is probably the most appropriate kind of gender dysphoria to treat with medical transition, is what I keep going back to. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
In the sense that it can't be changed.
Right.
Right, but when we just tell people that we're just treating gender dysphoria and leaving out all the gory details of autogynephilia, that's harmful to women. The people who actually are women, identify as women, and are not receptive to all of this stuff. You made an interesting point.
Oh, then you end up with the situation that what's unfolding in Scotland right now.
Yeah, you Aaron, you made an interesting point about harking back to the childhood thing. Okay, so as a person who suffers from autogynephilia, according to Dr. Blanchard, 75% of the trans population has autogynephilia. They're AGP homosexuals, and the other 25% is 25% the homosexual transsexuals. So 3/4 of that population of Blanchard's theories are under the AGP umbrella. So as a young child, I didn't have any stereotypical feminine behavior. I mean, we can go back in the photos, and there's pictures of me standing there in an army T-shirt with a tank on the front of it. There's drawings of me on top of a tank with holding a machine gun, mowing down Germans. Me building bicycle choppers as a kid, and going fishing, going hunting. My teenage years were mostly revolved around building race cars. And then, like all the other autogynephiles, well, not all of them, but I took, went into the military. We go into the military, we become firefighters, we become policemen, we become all these manly jobs. So where I'm going with this is, we're not intrinsically feminine whatsoever, like homosexual, transsexual. And that becomes this identity problem. And I think at some future point, this thing is going to fall apart, and that it's going to get some recognition. So how do I go into becoming a woman, or allegedly becoming a woman, because of my autogynephilia, this attraction to become one, and then square that against my history? And the answer is, I've created a lot of false memories now to make it work. Have y'all ever seen the movie Blade Runner, the first one?
Yeah.
Yeah, they've got that scene in there where Deckard interviews the replicant female, and Deckard is asking the replicant female about their childhood, and they're kind of going to pieces because there's no memory background of being a female, and there's also no behaviors of being a female. So it's like I don't have none of this to prop me up when I went into the gender transition, which creates this crisis. So, for example, I started reconstructing false memories. I can look back and say, oh, wow, when I was 5 in the barber chair, I was screaming my head off. And that was because I was a girl and you were cutting my hair. And I've done that with a lot of things, which has been really harmful. I mean, it's to the point my head is so screwed up that I don't know which is which anymore. Yeah.
I think we all do that to some extent. I mean, that seems pretty, maybe not all, but I mean, that seems pretty common, even amongst the homosexual, transsexuals, of rewriting the past, rewriting our history, and, to kind of recast ourselves as well. I was just a boy all along. And I mean, I would tell people that I played hockey instead of ringette, for example, like always editing, details of our lives. And it's exhausting to have to do that all the time. It's like being a closet case gay person, right? That it's exhausting being in the closet because you're having to always edit every time someone's talking about their childhood or whatever. In order for you to participate socially in those conversations, we have to quickly on the spot always be editing our own stories.
Right, and that false memory thing is a real problem. I mean, if psychiatry finally recognized it as a problem with the sexual abuse, how come they're unwilling to recognize it with the gender abuse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, we've been, as an organization, and as an alliance, we've received a lot of support. I would say probably about 90% support, but we have had some backlash. And most of the backlash is because of the fact that we do agree that there are different types of dysphoria, including AGP and the homosexual type, and the DSD type as well. But it seems so that, I mean, it seems to be something that it makes people pretty angry, right? That even just mentioning AGP and saying, well, I believe that exists. People kind of jump to, well, that's transphobic. You're saying we're all perverts, or we're all, just fetishists that are lying and manipulating. And that's never been our intention. It's my intention. What motivates me mostly is that we need to do what's right for the kids. I mean, I would rather not be coming out and telling my story and receiving backlash and stuff. But when I look at all the kids, I mean, even taking ROGD out of the picture, I mean, I do think that is real, but taking that out of the picture and even just looking at the two main types that Blanchard identified, most of the kids are probably going to be that homosexual subtype because AGP doesn't develop until later in life, right? I mean, you have to have a sex drive in order to develop a paraphilia. So most of these kids, I'm guessing, are either ROGD or have the homosexual subtype. And we know that most of the homosexual subtype kids desist by the time they reach adulthood. That roughly 85% of them end up resolving the gender dysphoria and just becoming happy, well-adjusted gay and lesbian kids. But I'm under the impression that, by labeling it all as just trans, it's all just the same. There's no subtypes. It's all, it's saying we're all just trans. It's all just gender dysphoria. We all have the same needs. That's my concern, is that if that's our narrative, we're not actually serving the needs of each individual kid that comes to clinics saying, I've got gender dysphoria. And I'm under the impression that a lot of this push to medicalize earlier and earlier and earlier, it probably works best for those with AGP in the sense of passing, because you mentioned, a lot of people with AGP weren't intrinsically very feminine as children, and so passing later in life, I think, is the primary obstacle that when they want to transition to female that they face is, well, now I've masculinized, and that can't be undone without major medical intervention. So wouldn't it be nice if I could have transitioned prior to puberty and onward? But that goal, though it serves perhaps the AGP agenda quite well in terms of passing later in life, it actually is doing a harm to all the other types of gender dysphoria, because what about all those kids that would have just turned into happy, well-adjusted gay and lesbian kids if they had been given the opportunity to go through puberty and work all of that out for themselves. So it's, and I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but the rush to medicalize earlier and earlier is actually probably transitioning a lot of gay and lesbian kids so that those with AGP can pass better as female later in life.
And most of the activists seem to be of the autogynephilic type, not the homosexual, transsexual type.
So my intent isn't to, kind of shame those with AGP. Like, I want to acknowledge it so that people like yourself, Lisa, can actually get the support and help that you're looking for. But also to protect those that have the other types of gender dysphoria, to make sure that they're receiving the most appropriate treatment for their type of. So when we call it all trans, we're not individualizing care for each person, and because I imagine we have different needs with different types of dysphoria.
See, I would do something totally different with what you're saying. Okay, so when we look at Blanchard stats that for the natal males that go under the trans umbrella, okay, so the 75% AGP and the 25% homosexual, transsexual, those stats theoretically aren't going to change. Now, what has changed is the availability of knowledge. Like I was talking about how earlier that I managed to go through my childhood, and then I managed to go through the military, and I was fine until I was exposed to the ideology. So nowadays we're exposing kids at the earliest possible ages. Okay, so AGP can theoretically be triggered by puberty. Okay, so now we're talking about males who are 12 to 13 years old, who are AGP, and they're just getting rubber stamped with gender dysphoria. Can you see a problem here? So they don't. So I'll expand on that. So the way I see the problem is they are just getting rubber stamped with gender dysphoria instead of getting a psychological evaluation that's unpacking what's going on. And okay, so now the harm in that is, okay, so I say I was one of them. Here I am, 14, 15 years old. I've already went through puberty, and I decide, I'm going to be a female. I'm really a female. And then I go down into the high school track and say, I'm going to be on the female team. And I start trashing the female runners with my male biology, which is probably exactly what is occurring up in Connecticut. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that situation. And how is that fair to females? And it's also not fair to me because, okay, you rubber stamped me with gender dysphoria instead of like unpacking what was going on and teaching me that I have a paraphilia and giving me alternate options to deal with the paraphilia instead of just rushing me into a gender transition.
Yeah, and I would say that point is probably true regardless of what kind of gender dysphoria people have, is nobody is kind of sitting down with us and explaining what that really means, right? Whether it's AGP or the homosexual subtype or whatever it was that led us to the gender dysphoria, none of us are getting that evidence-based, reality-based information. So that because people say, well, you're denying people the agency of doing what they want with their bodies, but I see it very differently. You're denying us agency to make choices with our lives because you're not providing us with actual reality-based information.
Right.
Yes.
So if I was in that scenario, I wouldn't have a daughter today because, I would have said, okay, well, I'm really female. The best thing to do with me is, chemically castrate me and then give me the bottom surgery when I hit 18 or whatever age I can get away with getting it. And then I would have went into all that without even knowing what was going on. I would have destroyed my reproductive system rather than saying, okay, well, this, I have this problem, these are my options to treat it. Maybe I can have somewhat of a normal life, have a family and do all those sorts of things.
Going back to what you were saying, that you weren't particularly feminine as a child, and most autogynephiles aren't. Not just not feminine. It seems to be like almost hyper masculine, typically quite masculine in their interests and behaviors and whatnot. So going back to the military thing, it seems that I had this theory, and I think you've demonstrated it to be incorrect. But I had this theory that a lot of people with AGP choose a career such as the military because it requires full time, it basically doesn't allow you to slip into that female presentation, that female behavior. It kind of forces one to be, to use Eddie Izzard's verbiage, in boy mode all the time. Do you not think there's any validity to that, or do you think it is just a sense of innately having very masculine career interests?
I think in my case, it challenges the whole theory, because it sounds really good that I'm going into the military to, that's my flight into hyper masculinity, to, protect me from the gender dysphoria and all that stuff. Well, going back to what I said earlier, if I didn't know any of that existed and I wasn't experiencing any of those problems at the time because I was unexposed to the ideology,
Right.
how can that be true?
Right. That's what I meant. You kind of contradicted that theory that I had developed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, it's not just you. I mean, there's lots of articles written by researchers to push these theories, to cover up the paraphilic behavior and make it sound more normal. Yeah.
Another thing that I've been wondering about is, so we know that say 75% of female to male to female transitioners are autogynephilic. How prevalent do you think that? I mean, you've done a lot of research into this. How prevalent do you think that particular paraphilia is in the male population writ large, regardless of those who seek transition? I think a significant number are now seeking transition with the gender ideology inundation and the medical availability of it. But like, do you think? Obviously, you're saying that for yourself, porn triggered it. It seems to be that could be a pretty common case nowadays with the availability of porn as well. But how common do you think autogynephilia is in the male population at large, regardless of transgender identification?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that.
Okay.
Without appropriate studies, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say that. But it is a problem. And you did touch on something that's really an issue now, which is kind of, what do we call this thing? The sissy ideology. Do y'all have any knowledge about
Sissification?
that? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's becoming, the website Women Are Human did a fantastic article on that, but that's becoming a real problem for young males. So they're getting exposure to pornography. And especially if they've got developmental issues or they've got self-esteem issues, they're not the kind of people. I was always extremely successful with women. So, people who aren't successful with women, and you give them, a host of reasons of why they could start just chunking away at their maleness, manhood, whatever you want to call it, and come up with ultimately that they're really females. And they're going down that pathway through the sissification route. It's almost like bordering the grooming kind of thing.
I met a guy many years ago. You reminded me of him, and he suffered from extreme anxiety to the point where it really impaired his ability to function in life because he was so afraid of making a wrong decision that he just didn't want to make any decisions. But in his mind, it's almost like he didn't register that he had anxiety, but he interpreted that as, well, I'm just a submissive and I need a dominant to make all the decisions for me. So he turned that into a sexual identity that then became a barrier for him not to actually treat the anxiety. But he was spending like thousands and thousands of dollars online getting, these professional female dominatrix to make all his life decisions for him because he was too anxious to make a decision. And imagine if that ideology caught on rather than the gender dysphoria one. If we started to create this worldview of we're all just either dominant or submissive, and if we don't want to make decisions, it's because we need a dominant to make all our decisions. I mean, it's kind of a parallel in a way. Like
it is.
Yeah, that we could just substitute, our mental health problems and find an external solution to that and call that an identity, because he was very fixed in that identity. No, I'm not anxious, I'm just a submissive.
Yeah, some of the videos on websites like X videos and X Hamster, things of that nature, I mean, they're very telling of how problematic the sissification ideology is, because it's like, back to what you said, it's kind of a convergence of BDSM and then sissification. So you have males that are taking these so-called beta males and sissifying them, but they're also stepping up the game and putting them on hormones. They're literally destroying their reproductive systems. And have y'all ever heard of a sissygasm?
No.
Yeah, this is embarrassing to admit, but I mean, I've actually gotten into this problem myself because I've went down that rabbit hole. So a sissygasm is when you become trained to only be able to orgasm through rectal stimulation of your prostate. And they also put these males into chastity devices. And so the only sexual relief they're allowed to have is through prostate stimulation. And there's a really fascinating article on that. It was actually a study about a man who was trained himself to become that way with one of the Anero's prostate tools. So it gets into the brain is actually plastic and can be programmed to think a certain way and continue to act a certain way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess the other rabbit hole is those that have a sexual fetish for mutilating their genitals, and we really have no idea how many people are getting the gender, what's called the gender affirmation surgery, for that reason.
Yeah, I believe it was the Daily Beast just did a pretty big article, and I think it's under the umbrella of cutting. Is that correct? Yeah. Cutters, cutters is what they call the guys who give unofficial sex changes. Yeah.
Wow.
So.
That would explain the absolute inability of some people to do post-care after surgery.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Some people don't take care of their, like after they've had genital surgery, they don't do any of the post-operative care. They end up with major complications. The vaginoplasty falls out. Yeah, or major internal infections. Like they're all on board. They get the surgery, and then after the surgery has been done, they totally disassociate from doing any of the care that's necessary to address the wound and the healing and the.
See, I think I can solve that riddle for you about why that, I can give you a very good potential reason about exactly why that's occurring. Okay, so as long as I have testosterone in my system, and this just isn't me, this seems to be a phenomenon with the AGPs in general. We're motivated to chase things like exactly what you're talking about. We have this image in our mind, one of Blanchard's types of autogynephilia, he breaks it down into 4 subsets. As we can be fixated on, say, for example, having a vagina. And then once our testosterone is cut off, that vagina is meaningless. So yeah, it's not a good idea to, that sort of person shouldn't be getting a quote sex change surgery, whatever you want to call the thing, gender confirmation surgery. Yeah, because as soon as they get it, the testosterone's cut off, the sexual desire to be a woman and have a vagina is cut off. Why would they take care of it? And then you also have to throw in, the trans population is extremely prone to having mental health issues, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, depression problems. So the people with depression and all those sorts of things, they go into these depressed modes and they don't have any physical energy to actually maintain their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
You've written a bit about different types of AGP. Do you mind kind of explaining what some of those different types are?
This is where we really get down the rabbit hole. Okay, so I've got these on my website, and Blanchard breaks it down. Okay, so the first type is what they call physiologic autogynephilia. And Blanchard gives the example of these are males who are sexually excited by being what's called pregnancy transvestites. They're also excited by things like lactating, breastfeeding, and even menstruating. So I actually have all 4 types of Blanchard's autogynephilia. So under that first type, the thing that plagues me is I've always been extremely sexually excited about inducing lactation. When I look back before I had this self-awareness about my issues, I can look back with shame at the photos of me using an electric breast pump on my breast trying to stimulate lactation. And it's really a shameful thing to look back on. And getting into how uneducated the medical establishment is. At one point while I was in Portland, this was after the non-binary sex change, I wrote my doctors and I actually asked them for a drug called, I believe it's called domperidone, to get me to cause lactation. And because there's no training on with stuff about teaching these doctors and these therapists about what Blanchard's theories are, this went right over their head that here I am asking for a drug to induce lactation when it was classic autogynephilia. That's how problematic that is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second type is called behavioral autogynephilia. And these are, just like it sounds, you do things you get sexual pleasure from imitating females. Some of the examples are, males actually have masturbation fantasies, these, where they were knitting in the company of other women, or going to the hairdresser or getting your nails done is actually a sexual experience. The third type is when you get into the autogynephilic, it's called anatomic autogynephilia. And this is where you start wanting to take on female body parts. Let's see here what Blanchard said on that one. This is the aroused by the thought of having a woman's body or parts of a woman's body, such as breast. This is a really interesting part of my trajectory, because when I started cross-dressing and I started screwing around with men, and I found out I could get fake breast forms. So I became obsessed with having fake breast forms. And then after the experience, I was content with taking them off, putting them in the closet, and until the next sexual experience, it wasn't a big deal that I didn't have breast. But then after learning that I could take hormones, down the road, learning that, I suddenly became obsessed with wanting breasts because of the hormones. And of course, I took hormones to get the breast. So there's, the same thing with our earlier conversation about, getting the fake vagina. Fortunately, that hasn't been my issue, but that's one of the reasons why people do it. And then the fourth type is just what classic transvestic autogynephilia, and that's getting sexual pleasure from, of course, cross-dressing, wearing female clothing. One of the examples Blanchard gives, and I'll validate it as being true, is when my wife puts her bra on in the morning, she's just putting her bra on. If I've got testosterone in my system, it's a sexual experience for me. I'm capable of getting an erection just by the mere act of getting dressed. That's how problematic all that is.
Do you think, is it anatomical autogynephilia? Is that the kind that can cause actual gender dysphoria, or can they all lead to that? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
I would rate that as the number one cause, because that collision of me wanting to have breast and not having breast, and was able to induce the gender dysphoria. So it's worthy of treatment, but again, it goes back to, we have to be honest about what we're doing, why the treatment is occurring, rather than passing me off as something that I'm not.
So otherwise, I imagine the drive would be to change your body.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If that's the nature of the paraphilia, is to want breasts and want a vagina, and that there must be a really strong drive then to medically transition if that's the nature of the paraphilia.
And well, that brings up an interesting point too. I mean, well, first I would say I would frame it as a progressive disease, that it just keeps escalating in steps. But then Blanchard gets into, I think he uses the term pair bonding. And what that means, I think the way he explains it is, say, for example, that I've been married to my wife for over 3 decades. So even if we get to the point where we don't love each other anymore, there's a good probability that we'll just stick together because we've pair bonded and we've been together so long that it doesn't make any sense for us to separate. And according to what I understand of what Blanchard says, the same thing happens to me with the autogynephilia, which probably explains why I'm still wearing women's clothing, even though there's no longer any sexual arousal in the thing. I've gotten so used to my, alter ego, Lisa, that Lisa's just become a part of me. So even though there's no sexual component of Lisa with me chemically castrated, Lisa still exists. There's another, I believe he's a psychologist named T. Buckner, and he wrote a really good document. It's called The Transvestic Career Path. And he lays out these steps of how a person becomes a transvestite. And one of the final steps is the formation of the alter ego of the female personality. It becomes almost like a permanent portion of the person's persona. Yeah. Which, the name Lisa was actually my very first transvestite alter ego name. So I have reverted back to it.
So with obviously you're of the camp that any that SRS, would you say SRS for people with the autogynephilic dysphoria, you were basically no question that's medical malpractice, correct?
That's a slippery slope. I think it should basically be, well, okay. First, when people are adults, they have the right to make medical decisions. So you have that quandary. Yeah, then the other part of it, I think it should be avoided at all costs. But there's going to be some folks apparently who, like me, you give me Lupron and I seem to be okay. It stops the thing. But what do you do with the folks where it doesn't stop the thing? And I think that's what the kinds of people that folks like Blanchard are basically supporting, saying, hey, we've tried everything else. They're adults, they get to do what they want. Now, again, the problem is recognizing them as females and doing that. When they start using the surgery to say, hey, I'm really a woman, instead of me fixing a paraphilia here, that's very problematic, and I don't agree with that.
I kind of wonder about the endpoint too. So let's say someone had the anatomical AGP and they did go through all of the medicalization, and so now they have the breasts that they desired, let's say. And does the nature of the paraphilia shift then, or what am I trying to say? So if someone has the breasts and that's arousing for them, does that satisfy the AGP, or is it like constantly distracting and you're aroused in at inappropriate times? Like what is the lived reality of that having reached that endpoint of a transition?
I can only answer for myself. It's appropriate for me to only answer for myself.
Sure.
About what my experience with that is. Okay, so chemically castrated, the sexual component is mainly gone. I don't go off and masturbate because I have breasts now. There's no desire to do any of that. But on the other hand, if I get up in the morning and walk in the bathroom naked, I look in the mirror and see breasts, and there's immense joy over that I have breasts. And another one of those things the sexologist like Blanchard has pointed out is, Like, or a regular natal female doesn't run around oftentimes fondling her own breast and getting sexual pleasure by fondling her own breast. But we AGPs, me, are very prone to doing that. Yeah. So there's still sort of a sexual component to it, even though the sex drive has been cut off. That, we got what we wanted.
It's why for me, it's always been kind of helpful to think of it as, because I've never really understood paraphilias. I think that's kind of a female thing in general. It doesn't really make sense to me. I can't really rationalize it, but it makes sense to me to think of it as basically inverted heterosexuality. So I think of it as like a sexual orientation is how I've always been able to conceptualize autogynephilia, which also makes sense in my brain as far as why. HRT, why inhibiting your testosterone, taking estrogen, doesn't completely eradicate it. It becomes, it's like, because the orientation remains. You're still attracted to yourself as a woman. It's just the sexual component to that is diminished, but it's not gone. Just like it would be for a sexual orientation. You know, like if you gave a homosexual, homosexual man estrogen, like he's still going to be gay. He's just going to have much less desire to act on those feelings. Does that make sense?
That's helpful. That actually I think speaks to what I was asking about, because I just wondered, because I have heard some people say that once they have AGP, so whether they knew it was that or not, but they had that sexual component and then they transitioned and now that sexual component isn't there. And for them, they had this disappointment almost. It's like, well, this was all about that sexual experience. And now, oops, now I don't even have a sex drive. I don't hear that talked about openly very much, but I can imagine that happening, but you're right, Aaron, that they would still have that the sexual orientation, just not the sex drive. But it would. I don't think, if we don't have a reality-based way of understanding this, I can see how people could kind of arrive at the point of feeling almost disappointed. It's like, I was after this, amazing sexual experience, and now that's been destroyed by the fact that I don't have a sex drive. Of course, not everyone's going to feel that, but I have heard that expressed by some.
You two said so many things. Well, I don't think I can even remember to get them all. Okay, now to do yours first. Okay, so this isn't a pleasant experience with the sexual excitement. So where I'm going to go with this, another one of the things Blanchard's pointed out is the transvestites, cross-dressers. They go through this endless cycle called binge and purge. So we go out and we load our closet up with high heels and dresses and stockings and all wigs and all breast forms and all this stuff. And we go, months, years, or whatever, going through that. And then we crash and burn and shame and we discard it all, which is very expensive to do. I'd like to have all my money back. And we just repeat this torturous cycle over and over. So I'm to the point where, like, the folks you're talking about are like, okay, so they went through this alleged gender transition. They hopefully got the body they were seeking. And then they're going like, oh, I don't have a sex drive anymore. Well, the route I'm going with this is like, that sex drive was my problem to begin with. And if I have that sex drive, I'm going to go through that endless torturous cycle of binging and purging and shame and all that. So it's better just the end result is that my sex drive is cut off. I'm in the body I was fantasizing about, and it's all over with. That's a much better outcome than the cycle of torture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really helpful to hear it that way, because I think when it's not our experience, it's easy to kind of misunderstand some of the fine details of it. So I think a lot of people, when they hear about AGP, they think of it as chasing the sexual fantasy. So it sounds like a fun thing, but you're not describing it as a fun experience at all.
No, it's torturous. And once you've been through that cycle numerous times and you realize what you're doing, yeah, it's just like, give me the genital lobotomy. Just make it end. Yeah, and that's, we're not being truthful about that. Once again, we're just framing the whole thing as gender dysphoria and sweeping it under the rug and leaving out all those nasty details of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Now, the other Aaron touched on the other problem with what's going on. this stuff about calling paraphilias sexual orientations. Again, that's just, to me, it's just more flim-flam language of hiding bad behavior and making it sound, legitimizing it, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, here's a really fun one. So, all right, so autogynephilia, and I would say it's been done to, after all the uproar of autogynephilia, it started getting toned down. Well, we'll just call it a sexual orientation instead. Well, now we're also calling pedophilia a sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Okay, these things are really paraphilias, not sexual orientations. Okay, so now getting into the harm thing. Okay, so I don't agree with people losing their jobs because of their, what is actually a sexual orientation, or because they want to go to work in a certain type of clothing. If I'm a male and I want to go to work dressed as a female, I shouldn't get fired about that. But when we go to the Supreme Court and we make it illegal to fire somebody because of a sexual orientation, and we're also calling pedophilia a sexual orientation, is it right that we can no longer get rid of a pedophile from employment? If a daycare it turns out that they've got a pedophile running around and pedophilia is a sexual orientation, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to point out the problems we have here.
I guess and I don't know, and you've obviously kind of laid it out as quite a problem, autogynephilia, that is. So I guess I was under the impression that I wouldn't equate the two because it seems like autogynephilia doesn't cause any harm. But you're obviously saying no, it absolutely is quite harmful and not as not a sexual orientation in that way. So I guess I was making the leap to pedophilia because I see a significant, obvious harm to that paraphilia. Whereas I guess I thought of autogynephilia as just like a private, fantasy that can be acted out with no harm to anyone. So, obviously separate to colonizing women's spaces. That's obviously a no-no around.
That's harm. Yeah.
Right.
Indulging my paraphilia, forcing you to indulge my paraphilia is harm. There's no way around that. So yeah, it's not this nice little harmless thing with gender dysphoria like we're trying, like other folks are trying to sweep it under the rug and portray it. No, not the case at all.
Yeah.
And then look at the behaviors we just went through under Blanchard's 4 subsets. Here I am, with testosterone, I'm prone to doing things like going out and buying a breast pump and pumping my breast and doing that as a sexual fetish. Is it fair for me to call myself a female and then, put myself in the women's bathroom with that sort of sexual behavior? Yeah, I mean, there's so many different avenues where this stuff is wrong that I just don't want to participate. I just want to be honest about what my problems are. I want to be honest about how they affect females, and then get the treatment to, resolve them in the least harmful manner. And it's very hard to do that. Like I said, I can just say I've got gender dysphoria and get all the care I want. The minute I say I've got a paraphilia, nobody wants to touch me.
It must be hard to find clinicians that even acknowledge that AGP exists, let alone how to actually help. Are you finding any support?
No. Yeah. The example I gave out of my VA medical records where the psychiatrist wrote in there that autogynephilia doesn't exist. I mean, how do I deal with a mental health industry that's operating on that kind of mindset? Or if they do know it exists, then they're going to claim that it's not a valid thing.
And they're kind of forcing you to live under this delusion that you're female. In order to treat you like you were saying that day in and day out, saying, oh, you're still a male, then you're not trans. It's like I encounter that obviously with just arguments. People are like, oh, if you say you're female, you may as well detransition, and that's infuriating enough. It's like I don't have to be ideologically captured or live under a delusion in order to treat my dysphoria. But it's basically like you were in a literal psych ward being forced to do that. I can't even fathom.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember sitting there in tears, explaining to them, that I didn't like my body, that the hair growing on me again, felt like I was suffocating, and explaining all those different types of how the dysphoria was affecting me. And they had blinders on. They were going, well, as long as you're a male, you can't possibly have gender dysphoria, and we're not treating you. Yeah, it was the most horrible experience that you can imagine, to be treated like that. At one point, I just broke down and said, look, I want the treatment, but I don't want the delusion. And they weren't swayed by none of that.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I mean, we're all experiencing that, but what Aaron just mentioned of, because gender dysphoria is completely separate from the gender ideology. There were transsexual people long before there was queer theory. And I experienced dysphoria long before I ever learned queer theory in the early 90s. But people have so completely understood the trans experience through queer theory that they can't even separate the two anymore. So it's completely confusing for people now when you just look at gender dysphoria without that lens of queer theory, that gets interpreted as transphobic. Because for them, like, trans is queer theory. They can't understand what gender dysphoria even means without queer theory these days, and it's created blinders that I don't know how we ever remove those. Like, even I posted on Twitter recently, like, how would we even do something like watchful waiting with the kids in this age of ideological capture, when the kids are learning that your experiences means that you are trans. I mean, that's not watchful waiting anymore. We're leading them down a path.
To what extent would you agree that the medical system itself has created gender dysphoria? Okay, so I'll give you a couple examples. Going back in history, as you were talking about, if there were no synthetic hormones and there were no surgeries, I mean, it would be something like, I can't drink alcohol until I'm 21, so not available. It's not. Why would I have any dysphoria over something I can't have?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you were stork dropped you on a desert island, a gloved hand reached out of a metal box and raised you until you were able to sustain yourself, and there was no other people, no human interaction whatsoever, how would you have gender dysphoria? It's the ideology and the medical treatments that are fueling it, in my opinion. Does that make any sense?
It does. And I think, I mean, in my case, I don't think the medical industry created my dysphoria, because I definitely experienced intense dysphoria as a child. And I grew up in an isolated farming community, no contact with the gay and lesbian community, I didn't even know that medically transitioning was even a thing. That just wasn't on my radar. But I had dysphoria to an extent where I really believed in some way that I was a boy. I didn't know I had an intersex condition then either. So it was beyond just being a tomboy. I mean, I looked at other boys and saw that they were swimming with no shirt on and a pair of trunks. So I whipped my shirt off and insisted on swimming with just a pair of shorts on. So it was very much an extreme, but it never crossed my mind to get a sex change until I learned that was a thing, right? So it was still, even though I had very intense legitimate dysphoria, I would still say I'm a victim of ideological capture, because prior to that, I was finding ways of integrating my dysphoria into a lesbian identity, and did that quite successfully and quite happily, until I started learning about, well, the ideology, and that if you had these feelings, well, no, you're not actually gay, you're actually a trans person. So we've invented this idea that there's a separate category of personhood called a trans person that now needs rights and medical interventions, and this whole industry now created for it. So that part, the medical industry is absolutely created. So trans is created by the medical industry.
Yes.
Yeah. I would say I always had. Oh, sorry. Go on, Kenneth.
I was going to say, it's also created the social sexualities, where a person's sexual orientation now goes based on gender identities of the individuals involved, and has nothing to do with the underlying biological realities.
Yeah.
What I felt I needed, kind of in hindsight, is I needed someone to kind of explain to me my gender dysphoria meant, in reality-based terms. All I needed was information, because the experience itself I had no way of understanding and attaching meaning to. And so it's almost like it creates this vacuum in me where I need it to make sense in some ways. So any narrative that kind of sounds plausible, it's so easy to grab a hold that, okay, that's the explanation that I've been waiting for, because nobody explained to me, well, it's quite, that a lot of gay and lesbian people have this kind of dysphoria, or a lot of people with the type of intersex condition you had experience this. Like, I needed a way of making sense of it. If someone had just said to me, hey, you know what, you're either feeling this because you just happen to be one of these lesbians that experience dysphoria, or that you have an intersex condition, and this is what it means, I think that would have satisfied my need to make sense of it without having to do anything else, no medical interventions or anything. So it wasn't until I grabbed a hold of that explanation of, it's because you are trans. And if you are trans, that's what drove me to then transition. It's like, well, if I am actually trans, and that means I am a man in some way, then I have to transition. It's created this sense of urgency that I can't possibly be trans and not do an intervention. So medically transitioning almost became a compulsion or an addiction for me, that I need to do this. I can't. It created this dissatisfaction with my own body, because I was being told by that narrative, you are actually a man trapped in a woman's body, or however that narrative goes. But until I learned that narrative, I didn't feel any drive or compulsion at all to change my body.
What about the frequent thing of the feeling different? So in your case, you obviously felt different from other females growing up. So where I'm going with that is, how much of a component is that feeling different thing as a driver? And then how much of a problem is that feeling different thing a sort of like a perception disorder? Because you frequently hear trans-identifying people saying, well, I feel like a girl, or I feel like a boy, or I feel like a man. And at my level of knowledge now, I could never be a therapist, because I would just be sarcastic, and I would say, well, which man do you feel like? Is it an NFL player? Is it a gay man? Do you have a name for this guy? So, right. So once you start thinking about it that way, there's what's going on in my head that with this feeling different thing, even though that is one of the components of gender dysphoria. Yes. And one of the things that's starting to come to light too. Are y'all familiar with like the six or so questions in DSM-5 about whether or not you have gender dysphoria? Because those questions in themselves literally take a non-conforming female and give them, I think they only need like 2 or 4 of the 6 questions. But like I said, those questions are worded in such a manner that the nature of their nonconformity to begin with gives them an automatic gender dysphoria diagnosis. And that's really problematic.
Because it could have just been an autistic kid that was non-conforming because they didn't pick up on social cues or didn't care about conforming so much. I mean, that's a symptom of autism, right? But once they were taught this narrative, it's easy to look back on our childhoods and find evidence.
That goes back earlier what I was saying about you're creating false memories about what was true and what wasn't true.
Yeah, because maybe it was just autism all along. That feeling of there's something different about me, right? So once, let's say we're 15 and learning that gender ideology, it's easy to look back on our histories and say, oh well, I guess that's why I didn't fit into my social circles when I was 5, right? Not seeing that, well, maybe that was because of autism that I wasn't fitting into my social circles.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions is like, whether you have a strong desire to have the body of the opposite sex. Well, if I have a perceptual disorder that I feel like I'm a female, then that's going to give me a drive to want the body of the opposite sex. So again, I'm going to answer yes to that question. And I'm just steady checking boxes about why I should have a gender dysphoria diagnosis and why I'm supposedly not really male.
we're already past an hour and a half, so we probably want to start wrapping this up soon. But I was hoping you could tell us about the website that you have compiled, the endless database of trans content.
Ooh, the website will begin with, it has to move as much as I do. It's had y'all can all guess why, but it's had numerous takedowns. The trans activists have reported me numerous times because I have dead names on there. Sorry, they're in the news articles. So I'm just reporting the news. But where you're going is, I have this massive website, and it gets back to, I think I have Asperger's, and I spent nearly every single day, many, many hours every day from 2013 all the way up into probably late 2019, building this massive repository of media articles about all things trans. And then I took those news articles and I broke them down into categories. And most importantly, I archived them because they're very prone to disappearing. And the funny thing about the archiving was, I was a tank mechanic in the military. So I don't have any formal training on, websites and none of these kinds of things, but I learned from the feminist, how to build these websites. I would say I learned the most from Kathy Brennan. They often call her, the head turf or whatever. I think that's unfair, but Brennan taught me by looking at her website how to archive articles. I mean, she was amazing at that. So, I mean, there's like thousands of people. The latest home for the website is autogynephilia.me. And it's from A to Z on categories about why trans people are doing what they do. Blanchard says the autogynephilia is best captured by what people say about themselves. And a lot of these articles are interviews with trans people. So this is trans people saying, what their experience was, what their trajectory was, and I've captured that. So yeah, it's good stuff for researchers. Good place for self-exploration too.
Yeah, I was blown away because the title of it is a bit misleading. It was autogynephilia.me, and I thought it was just gonna be like a blog or something about your experience, and then I was like, oh my god, this is an endless database of anything trans related. So I highly recommend everybody check that out because you can just search a name and suddenly you've got 20 articles regarding that person or that topic, and yeah, it's incredibly useful.
Yeah, the name is a misnomer. It's just, now that I understand that I have autogynephilia, I wanted that domain because it was available, and everything else just got chucked in there. It used to be under the transgender archives and various names, but like I said, WordPress deleted me twice because of complaints. Yeah. So now it's safely tucked away in Iceland. It's not part of America. It's out of the reach of the laws of EU, and I can say whatever I want on there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a pleasure. I've been, when Aaron mentioned he had reached out to you and you had agreed to talk to us, I was really excited about it. As Aaron said in the beginning, you're world famous for your journey, and I really respect and appreciate how open and honest you are about your experience, because that's exactly what we need at this hour is just for people to open up and just be honest about what all of this is about. So,
and thank the three of you as well for hosting me and letting me speak. I mean, I'm like blown away that much time has went by already. I've immensely enjoyed talking to y'all and learning from you as well.
I know, and speak for the rest of them.
Thank you so much.
We'd love to have you back sometime if you'd be willing. There's obviously so much we could talk about if you'd interested in coming back sometime.
Yeah, and I would highly encourage y'all on one of your future episodes. Take DSM-5, take those gender dysphoria criteria, and break that down and see what it looks like about how easy a lesbian could get a gender dysphoria diagnosis. I think the public would be shocked about that.
mm-hmm.
The AGPs, we lie to get our diagnosis. Y'all get sucked in by design, which is tragic. Yeah. Okay, everybody, y'all take care. Stay
too.
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.